New Blog 18. After leaving our house, we went to see Uncle Jacob and Daniel, to give the donkeys back and let them know what was happening as well. They wanted to play their part, and John arranged that certain disciples would be able to stay there, Philip and Andrew amongst others. Leaving the donkeys, we walked on down into town, to see what there was and to meet with Matthew and Salome when they arrived. After having lived in Antioch and more recently Capernaum, Magdalene didn't seem to have much going on in it. The market square dominated, and there was a street leading down to the docks that had permanent shops and services. A blacksmith and carpenters, a general food store, a cloth and rope merchant, and of course places where the fish were displayed that had been brought in from the boats. The synagogue was on the side of the square furthest from the sea, and we passed by without seeing anyone outside. There were just a few people around the square, as the afternoon heat was still strong. Quite soon there would be many more. We walked down to the jetties, where several fishing boats were tied up. Andrew's boat had not yet arrived, but there was a sail out on the sea. John said it was Andrew's boat for sure, though how he could say at that distance I didn't know. We sat and waited under an awning, attached to the front of a closed shop. It was quiet and beautiful, and the boat sailed closer quite quickly. It was Andrew's. When it arrived, the first person I saw was Rachel. What a surprise! What a fabulous surprise! We hugged each other in greeting. She had arrived at Marimian soon after we had left, it seemed. Salome was there, of course, organising the supplies, and she had brought Sarah with her. Also Matthew and 6 aspiring disciples. That included Joe and Mark. Matthew and Mark were related, and they had a mutual cousin living in Magdalene. They were staying with him and his family, whilst the 4 other aspirants would be at Jacob and Daniel's, and would be helping us carry the supplies up to Ma's house. We should have brought the donkeys, I thought, but we managed the bags and packages between us. Salome met my mother, and they got on well, luckily, for I didn't know how Ma was going to take to the assistance being offered. But Salome seemed to understand her, and I think Ma seeing Rachel again helped as well. Having set their things at Jacob's house, the 4 young men came back with Daniel, and all together we went back down to the square. Matthew, Joe and Mark were already there, talking to some men and women at an evening tea bar. We went over and joined them. There was such a difference between Yeshua's followers and most people in the square in Magdalene. Was it just a question of happiness or purpose, or more than that? Maybe it didn't matter what it was, but the people certainly were responding to be told about the Master's message. Hope for the promised land, which he said could be fulfilled in them. The kingdom was at hand, and all were being invited to come to the banquet, where even the sick could be healed, so they could partake in the peace he brought as well. There were some clear candidates for this healing help in evidence in Magdalene. I talked to a woman who was in a bad way, but mostly I think because she had lost her husband and little boy. Talking about it helped her a bit. Rachel was looking after another woman with more obvious physical ailments. One man seemed oddly dangerous, and no one could approach him. Blind and dumb though he was, the demon that possessed him did not seem so helpless, quite the opposite in fact. It was unsettling when he was anywhere around, exuding tormented hatred. I did meet up with some people whom I'd known as a girl. I hardly recognized them, as our lives had travelled such different paths. Yet meeting again was a kind of amazement in the context of Yeshua coming to Magdala that held great joy for me, to tell them this wonderful news. Almost everyone was interested, and would come and hear the Master speak when he came. Then there were the Pharisees. They came into the square together. There were 3 of them. I wondered if one of us should speak to them, but before I had the chance to go and ask John, who was on the other side of the square, they'd gone over to Joe. He seemed relaxed enough and chatted to them easily. Maybe I was being silly. I just felt there was something ominous about them. Matthew had wandered over to Joe as I watched. In a little while the Pharisees all turned and left. What had they wanted? We asked Joe. He said they seemed interested in finding the kingdom that Yeshua proclaimed. Joe told them that he would be in Magdalene tomorrow. It wasn't good news, but the master didn't seek to avoid the Pharisees, just not to play their game by their rules, John said. Rachel said that when she'd arrived at Meridian earlier that day, there had been a group of Pharisees outside. They had been quite unpleasant, she said, and Philip, Simon and Judas had their hands full in containing their abusiveness. Sun had almost gone down, and shadows were melting into the dusk. I was at the furthest corner of the square, nearest to the sea, looking back at the town of my youth. This place evoked so many memories in me, so much that was wonderful, and some that was painful too. It was as if this was my life laid out in front of me. Everything had a place, a meaning, that I accepted somehow without knowing why. People busy with their lives, trying to make sense out of the efforts needed simply to deal with all the burdens piled on them. That was how I had found it was everywhere. Then there was the possessed man. How terrible it must be for him, caught in an ongoing horror just as I had been. Could there be a way out for him too? Even the Pharisees. I had been a priestess. My mind was trained to follow the ways of religion too. They were a part of what I was, and this frightened me, because only my heart could truly understand the Master, because it had felt his great kindness. Only that was taking me where I needed to go. Tomorrow he would be here, coming to my own town, to where my life had been formed. My greatest hope was to continue to be with him and learn from him, continue to make use of this chance we were having right now, and that the people of this town, my town, could also benefit.